The Prime Minister has defended the British ambassador to Washington, Lord Mandelson, after more details emerged about his friendship with the convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Peter Mandelson says he regrets that friendship ever happened. The pressure is mounting on the Prime Minister to do something about it, but will he stick with his man in Washington? We'll discuss on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it is Chris at Westminster.
And it's Caitríona in the Newscast Washington studio.
Which is basically kitted out to look exactly like the Newscast studio in London. So if you're watching this, it looks very, very similar, but we're actually hundreds and hundreds of miles apart. So the first thing we're going to talk about on this episode is the growing pressure on the Prime Minister to do something about the British ambassador to Washington, who is, of course, Lord Mandelson, Peter Mandelson. Now, we already knew that Peter Mandelson had a friendship with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted paedophile who took his own life while awaiting trial on some other charges. But actually, we've learned more about just what good friends they were in the last few days, and that has resulted on pressure being applied to the Prime Minister about why he hired Peter Mandelson for the job in the first place. Chris, there's a lot of politics that has happened around this in the last 24 hours, so we'll talk about that in a second. But first of all, Caitríona, let's just sort of rewind a bit and just explain to people the new evidence that has come into the public domain about just how good friends Peter Mandelson was with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, so this is coming from the so-called birthday book, which was hinted at earlier in the summer when the Wall Street Journal published an article about it. And they were far more focused on President Trump's alleged page in this birthday book, as you can imagine. A page that we should say, he says, isn't his signature, doesn't exist, and he's suing the Wall Street Journal for $10 billion over it. Fast forward a little bit, and one of the committees on Capitol Hill here, the House Oversight and Reform Committee, who are investigating Jeffrey Epstein in this ongoing saga about releasing files and what files exist and so on, it subpoenaed Jeffrey Epstein's estate for this birthday book, which the estate handed over. And in that birthday book, there are dozens of messages from all sorts of people, some famous people, some not famous people, names are redacted and so on. But there is a lengthy message, if you like, from Lord Peter Mandelson talking about their friendship. It includes photographs of the two together, and the types of messages that Lord Mandelson has said, you know, he regrets and are very embarrassing and wishes weren't in the public domain. But that was just released here on Monday. So that's what's kind of spurred all of this action. People are going through that birthday book and some other documents as well, page by page, line by line, and there's a kind of drip of involvement of various individuals.
And Chris, the next thing that happened was that Lord Mandelson actually decided to just address this head on, and he did it via a new podcast and TV show that's been launched in America by Harry Cole, who used to be the political editor of The Sun here, but is now doing all sorts of things over in Washington.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was sat at home this morning with my headphones on, about to go on the radio and talk about the Labour Party deputy leadership race. And I saw that Harry was on social media in the middle of the night, Washington time, and he'd just done this interview on YouTube for this the new program that he's got. Harry Cole Saves the West, I think.
Modestly titled.
Which is it's an understated title from Harry. Anyway, he's been talking to Peter Mandelson about the nature of that friendship, and not least, as Caitríona was saying, that those birthday messages from 20 odd years ago, but also the extent to which that connection between the two men continued as it became more and more apparent of the crimes that Epstein had committed.
And let's listen to a little bit of Peter Mandelson talking to Harry Cole on Harry Cole Saves the West.
One, I feel a tremendous sense, a profound sense of sympathy for those people, those women who suffered as a result of his behaviour and his illegal criminal activities. And secondly, I regret very, very deeply indeed carrying on that association with him for far longer than I should have done. And I regret very much that I fell for his lies. I fell and accepted assurances that he had given me about his indictment, his original criminal case in Florida. Like very many people, I took at face value what he said.
So, Chris, I think there's three things that jump out of there. The first two are like the key messages that Peter Mandelson wants to get across. One, sympathy for the victims. Two, immense regret for ever being friends with Jeffrey Epstein. But then a third one, which was slightly more surprising, which is him saying there's going to be more stuff to come out.
Yeah, and for me, that was the standout thing from the 5-minute or so conversation on this theme. Because sometimes in a situation like this, let's take a couple of steps back. You know, there's a thing swirling and someone's at the heart of it, and they decide, you know what, it's time to go on the telly or whatever and take every question you can imagine and sort of deal with it in the hope that that kind of sorts it out, really, and sort of parks it. And it did feel like that kind of conversation until Lord Mandelson said explicitly that there would be more things to come and it would be deeply embarrassing. And then I was thinking as I heard it, that, you know, that means this will have legs, this will carry on. And we've had a sense of that with a drip of suggestions that we're looking into now as we record at 6:45 on Wednesday evening. And then, and this one brings us forward to lunchtime, UK time, with Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, that the central question at the heart of this is for the Prime Minister. Because Lord Mandelson, when he went out to Washington, having been appointed ambassador, would have known, I mean, a lot of it was a long time ago, but would have known the nature of the relationship and friendship that he had with Jeffrey Epstein and the nature and volume of communications that he had and the extent that they might be sitting in places where at some point they see the light of day. He would have known all that. The key question is what conversation happened between the Prime Minister and Peter Mandelson before he was appointed, and also what did the process around due process, as the Prime Minister called it in the Commons today, what did that get to about the nature of that relationship? And in essence, therefore, was Downing Street either insufficiently curious about the friendship, or did it know more than we've known until now, but decide on balance that they thought he was the best person for the job, and if it comes with some embarrassing revelations down the track, we'll try and sort of ride that out and get on with it because he's the best guy to have a good relationship between the British government and the Trump administration. And when we've asked those specific questions, we don't get a straight answer.
And let's hear how some of that played out in Prime Minister's questions in the badinage between Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer.
This is interesting, Mr. Speaker. He says the ambassador has expressed full regret, but the victims of the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein have called for Lord Mandelson to be sacked. And just so the House is aware, in 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was convicted of child prostitution and sex trafficking that took place between 2002 and 2005. That is the precise period which Lord Mandelson called Jeffrey Epstein his best pal. Absolutely. Was the Prime Minister aware of this intimate relationship when he appointed Lord Mandelson to be our ambassador in Washington?
Mr. Speaker, as she and the House would expect, full due process was followed during this appointment, as it is with all ambassadors. The ambassador has repeatedly expressed his deep regret. He is right to do so. He's now playing an important part in the US-UK relationship.
Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, I asked the Prime Minister if he knew. The fact that he didn't answer indicates that he probably did know. I wasn't asking a question about process, I was asking a question about his judgment. The Daily Telegraph reports today that while Lord Mandelson was business secretary, he brokered a deal with Jeffrey Epstein while he was business secretary, and that this occurred after Epstein had been convicted of child sex offences. Given this new information, does the Prime Minister really think it is tenable for our ambassador to remain in post?
Mr. Speaker, the relationship between the US and the UK is one of our foremost relationships, and I have confidence in the ambassador in the role that he is doing.
Okay, so that's the pressure being piled on the Prime Minister by Kemi Badenoch. And actually, Chris, Kemi Badenoch got quite good reviews for PMQs this week because she punched the bruise, having missed the bruise completely last week with Angela Rayner, which is a bit of a sidebar issue, obviously. Yeah,
she prosecuted the argument, if you like, the case for the critique of the appointment of Lord Mandelson as the ambassador in Washington with a doggedness today. And you could hear in the cheers from Conservative MPs a certain relief that she had done that, because there are some who've been kind of underwhelmed by her performances recently. In fact, at one point, the Prime Minister, who was very much on the back foot in the exchanges, teased her about her failure to hold him to account about the Angela Rayner revelations a week ago. And Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, also chimed in with questions on the topic as well. So it was an uncomfortable set of exchanges for the Prime Minister, because, as I say, it does come back in the end to his judgment. It is a story about him.
And then, Caitríona, two things to you. The first one is, how does all of this play into the upcoming timeline, which includes the massive Trump state visit to the UK next week?
It couldn't come at a worse time, really. I mean, that's an understatement, because this is making a great big difficulty for President Trump as well as for the ambassador, because President Trump and the White House are saying this is a Democratic hoax. They initially said that book never existed. Now they're saying that the president's page in it is a fake, that it's not his signature. But with Lord Mandelson saying, oh no, well, my pages are real and this book does exist, it's now in the hands of members of Congress, that's a big problem for the president. He is trying so hard to get away from this story. And suddenly now he's going to be going on this state visit, you know, with someone who has been talking about this book, has been talking about the relationship, their embarrassment, their regret. So there's just no way of President Trump getting away from that story when he goes to the UK next week. So that's really problematic for him. The mere presence of Lord Mandelson beside him at these events is going to immediately bring that story back up for the media and the domestic audience here. So that's a great difficulty. And, you know, if something should happen to Lord Mandelson's position, if the Prime Minister changes his mind on this, suddenly doesn't have confidence in him, what message is that sending to the US and to President Trump about how the Prime Minister views people who had relationships with or friendships with Jeffrey Epstein?
And Caitríona, you're such a professional podcaster. You combined my second point into the first one. So well done, saving everyone's time. So thank you. But Chris, talking about time, we're recording this episode at 6:49 on Wednesday evening. And just in the last few hours, there've been some more reports pertaining to the additional material that Peter Mandelson said might emerge.
Yeah, there's been more from The Sun and from The Times, and yeah, we're looking into that, seeing how we can verify it. And these are stories that speak to the exact point that Lord Mandelson said in his interview about more details to come. And I think what's interesting about this, Adam, and some of this goes beyond, I think, or at least teases away at the perhaps the distinction between the kind of vetting and due process that an ambassador might go through or does go through before their appointment, and then the sharp end political detail of this, particularly when you've got a political, you're appointing a Labour grandee into a role that's normally occupied by a career diplomat, which is the kind
type of grandee.
Yeah, quite. But where, I found myself this afternoon thinking, and it seems like a bizarre comparison, so bear with me on this. Rewind to the expenses scandal of 15, 16 years ago at Westminster. Of course, big numbers could do politicians damage in that, but detail could be deadly. So, you think of floating duck islands and on trouser presses and all the rest of it. The human detail. So there is a political distinction, as there is just in generally, really, I think, between the knowledge of a friendship in this instance, which was known about, and then hearing particular words like the yum thing in the birthday element, or the nature of how two people interact, because it illustrates a depth or closeness to a relationship or friendship, an association, call it what you want, that merely saying there was one doesn't quite get to. And I think that's where, over and above any other specifics that might be coming, that are politically difficult, but might not necessarily, and I don't know, because we don't know exactly what was touched on, obviously, in this due process that went on before the appointment, but might not come up in your more traditional kind of checking of someone's details or credentials or backstory prior to doing a job. Not least because whilst these questions raise massive questions on judgment for Peter Mandelson, then judgment for the Prime Minister in the appointing of Peter Mandelson, Jeffrey Epstein is dead. So, that sense where you might have there might be questions raised about the appointment of an official because of a connection they have with someone and what that might mean about a conflict of interest or whatever, if they're still very much sort of on the stage an active player, is of course something that officials and prime ministers would weigh up in some instances. In this instance, it seems to me the sharp end of this is political as opposed to what a conventional process of checks might normally serve up as either a kind of all this is fine or what about this because might this not be a bit sticky.
Yeah, because when you get like the highest level of security clearance to get a job like being ambassador in Washington, they're going through things like, could you be blackmailed? Do you have you committed a crime that people didn't know about? Do you have dodgy financial dealings? They're not saying, oh, how would it look if some pages photocopied from a book that was prepared for someone else's birthday might look when they land in the press.
Yeah, particularly about a friendship and an association that is publicly known about. So it's not even in that strict sense something that's a total revelation out of the blue. But the detail can be deadly in this sort of thing in a political awkwardness sense. Yeah.
Caitríona, I mean, Peter Mandelson was getting quite good reviews up till now, wasn't he, for his role?
Oh, absolutely, he was. That relationship that he had with President Trump or has with President Trump and the various other administration officials, that in a way he was resetting a relationship that hadn't been quite so great when Joe Biden was in office there, and a lot of that spanning on from Brexit and various other issues over the years. And, we think back to that scene when Lord Mandelson was standing beside President Trump behind the desk in the Oval Office on the occasion of the trade deal, and the Prime Minister was on speakerphone, and it was all very jovial and jokey and making gags about driving Aston Martins and so on. From a kind of brand UK perspective, you couldn't have hoped for a better person, really.
Well, we shall see what the next few hours, the next few days brings. Caitríona, thank you very much.
Pleasure as always.
And Chris, thanks to you.
Ta-ra.
Right, let's do a little bit of geopolitics now. There's a few things to round up, and the person who's going to do the rounding up for us is Mikey Kay, presenter of the BBC's Security Brief. Welcome to Newscast, Mikey.
Thank you.
For newscasters, would you like to tell us a little bit about your background, first of all?
Yeah, sure. I started off joining the Royal Air Force at age 18. Grew too tall for fast jets.
You are very tall.
At 6'6", ejector seat problem. So ended up flying assault helicopters. But at the time, it was sort of, in terms of operational experience, it was a blessing. Did tours in Northern Ireland, operational tours in Kosovo. Ended up working with Special Forces guys, specifically from Hereford, on a lot of operations in Iraq, targeting high-value Al-Qaeda assets. Got involved in military strategic campaign planning in Afghanistan, non-combatant evacuation operations out of West Africa, and disaster relief and humanitarian assistance after the tsunami in 2004. So a very privileged sort of broad spectrum of experience at the tactical and the strategic level. There's obviously a lot of geopolitics that's involved in that you get exposed to. Left in 2012 and then wanted to get into broadcast media, ended up doing a fair bit of war correspondent work.
And that's the end of the job interview. You got the job. Sorry, I hope that didn't sound too formal, but I did want to just let people know some of the exciting things that you've done with your life.
Sorry for boring you.
No, not at all. It's really exciting. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is this thing that happened overnight, Tuesday into Wednesday, a load of Russian drones going into Poland. What do we think the Russian strategy tactic was there?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is I never place an emphasis on Putin, Peskov, Lavrov telling the truth. And so I think what they say, you can't take at face value. There has to be a lot of corroboration behind that. We live in a landscape of misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation, and there are no better people at that than the Russians. So that would be my first piece. The second point I would like to highlight is a couple of days prior, you had a SS-26 short-range ballistic missile that was launched by Russia, and it ended up hitting the cabinet meeting rooms in the middle of Kiev. That's the first time a government building has been hit. Now the Russians,
which is an escalation.
Absolutely. I mean, can you imagine if Zelensky now takes the opportunity to now target the Kremlin? That's not going to go well in any means. So hopefully pragmatism will fall out beyond that. But the Russians are now saying that, again, that was a mistake. It wasn't supposed to be targeted. And likewise, with now these 19 drones in Poland, they're saying that they flew off course and there was no intentional target there. Now, again, you can't take that at face value. The Russians have been, in July alone, the Russians have launched 6,000 drones on Ukraine, and a lot of them are hitting targets. And I think it's quite unusual for 19 drones to be misguided, specifically without any counter evidence. So when I say counter evidence, I mean any counter opportunities that, say, Ukraine or Poland have been doing, whether it's using radio frequency or kinetic or whatever it is, to put the drones off course. Now, what I would say, though, just as a caveat, is before we make any conclusions on why those 19 drones did venture into Poland, there is a requirement to understand what those drones were, because I've seen the picture evidence.
And what were they?
I don't know is the answer. I haven't seen that type of drone before. The Russians had the blueprint of the Shahed 136, which is it's called a one-way attack drone. They're commonly called as kamikaze drones, but kamikaze doesn't quite make sense because there's no one in them. And obviously that came from the Japanese in World War II. So
the idea is they just hit their target and that's it.
Exactly, yeah. So one-way attack drones, Shahed 136, you can churn them out in the hundreds, if not thousands. And so without understanding what the drone is, what the command and control of the drone is, so what is it guided by? Is it guided by a mother radar and then becomes autonomous within a certain couple of miles or kilometers?
I mean, why does all of that stuff matter? Because if you listen to Donald Tusk, the Polish prime minister, he's basically saying, oh, this is like a real act of aggression by Russia. Are you saying actually that might be a bit of an overreaction to it?
What I'm saying is that from my perspective is that when you're going to accuse Russia of putting 19 drones into Poland, who are now calling for NATO Article 4,
which is basically for NATO allies to consult each other about the situation.
Yeah, so NATO Article 4, if it's approved, basically pulls in support to Poland, right? And the idea of that of Putin being comfortable with that wouldn't sit right. So provoking that, of which he knows what would happen, I think wouldn't play into Putin's strategy. Okay, because what it does is it just puts more NATO forces closer to Ukraine, which again is not one of the demands.
So basically everyone today saying, oh, this is Putin being deliberately provocative. They may be right, but that's still a theory.
Well, I think in order for NATO to come up with a conclusion as to why this happened, they have to understand the guidance mechanisms of what the drone is in order for them to look at the possibility of those guidance systems basically having a malfunction.
Right.
Whether that's distance, whether that's a weakening of radio frequency. If the drones are autonomous means that they're not being guided by something. They've got their own autonomous systems. And if they're autonomous, then you're sort of thinking, well, 19 going wrong? That would be, that would be one sort of not real possibility. But if they're guided by the same mother guidance system and that went wrong, then that, there's more possibility of that happening. So I just think there needs to be some, for want of a better word, forensic evidence on what those drones were, what the guidance systems were. And then, you've got very clever people who are looking at these systems and just sort of making a realistic assessment on how realistic was it that 19 of them could, go off frequency or whatever.
And that's so interesting because that presumably is why Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, the French president, have used the same words to describe this. Reckless, because reckless leaves it open. There's a spectrum of possibilities there, with an intentional kind of trying to provoke Poland and NATO at one end, and yes, something a bit more mistaken at the other. Yeah,
and that's basically risk. Risk is probability versus consequence, and the fact that what the Russians are saying, which again I'll reiterate, I think we've got to take at face value. But the consequences of it happening are, threat to life. Irrespective of whether it was intentional or unintentional, there is a threat to life. Now, there's also a super consequence from this as well, from Poland, which is, and we go back to this conversation again about counter-drone capability. And I've been at DSEI today, which is the huge military capability exhibition over at Excel in London. I'm specifically looking at counter-drone capability and what's out there, because it's all about the cost-benefit ratio. So I've got sources that have been flying in Typhoons against Houthi targets, and they've had to launch a $2 million ASRAAM missile, which is effectively a infrared guided missile, to take out one drone, a Houthi drone, in a swarm of 30. And it's just the cost benefit ratio is just not there. So going to DSEI, there's a lot of technology out there, counter drone technology, kinetic, that reduces that cost benefit ratio to very manageable parameters. And, I think that's and I don't think it's a bad thing, because I think, Poland obviously is within the target range, and they do need some form of system, close-in system, layered defense system that can actually target drones effectively and at mass.
Yeah, fascinating. The other story that was huge this time on Tuesday evening, and you were talking about it on the security brief on the BBC News, was the Israeli strike on Hamas officials in Doha, the capital of Qatar. What more have you gleaned about what was going on there?
So many unanswered questions. So, one of my jobs was effectively running for want of a better word, the Top Gun school for warfare in helicopters. So understanding threat systems, surface-to-air, air-to-air systems, and then looking at self-defense capabilities to be able to counter those. So the big question for me was, obviously there was a lot of talk about what are the consequences of this, but I wanted to use that experience to go back to the beginning and just ask the basic question, and the Times were reporting that it was 15 jets that got airborne. We don't know whether that was all F-35s. We don't know whether that was a combination of F-35s, F-15s and F-16s. I would suggest, in my experience, it would be a composite air package, so a mixture of capability that allowed them to get that far. But the big question is how do you get 15 fast jet aircraft from Israel to get close enough to Doha, put 10 munitions onto a building that's got Hamas officials in it, and then get back? And then there's all sorts of questions that this raises, okay? So the direct line between Tel Aviv and Doha is around 1,800 kilometers. In order to go direct line, you've got to go across Jordanian airspace and then Saudi airspace. That's the most direct line. Now, the Jordanians have already come out and said there were no Israeli Defense Force fighters entering or crossing their airspace. So then what's the next sort of most predictable route? Well, you can either go north in through Syria, Iraq, but you still have to come back down through Jordan, and then into Saudi. So that's a lot of countries to negotiate. Or you come south out of Israel, you avoid Jordan, then you turn east and you transit Saudi Arabia. So a couple of things that drop out of that. The first thing is...
Did Saudi Arabia give them permission to do this?
Did the Saudis know about it? And it doesn't matter what question you ask, is if they did know about it, then that would be the reason why you have 15 aircraft crossing a sovereign airspace uncontested. So did the Saudis give the nod? Were they aware? We don't know. If the Saudis didn't know about it, that's still a major problem, because if you're Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia have got quick reaction alert basically means putting air defense fighters on a 24/7 standby, where if radar picks up an unidentified package,
they can intercept it.
Exactly, they get launched and intercept. So if the answer is no, they didn't know about it, then you're like, you guys have got a bit of a problem here that you need to address.
So they're either complicit or poorly defended.
Bingo.
Yeah,
absolutely. I keep saying bingo at the moment, actually, but it is a perfect word for saying absolutely accurate.
Okay.
And then there's more.
Yeah.
And then you come into how close can an F-35 get to Doha without being seen on radar? Now, a primary radar goes out to around 250 miles. So if I'm a targeteer in the Israeli Defense Force, I want to be going, well, let's choose the F-35 fifth generation fighter low radar cross section. Let's use that as the platform, and then let's use a standoff weapon so it can stay as far away from radar as possible to launch those strikes.
Right.
And when you do your research on that, there is a weapon called Rampage that has a 250 kilometer standoff capability. And then there's another one called ROX that has a 500 kilometer capability. So it's kind of like a jigsaw, right? You're piecing it all together. And then the next thing you go is like, well, Qatari's quick reaction alert didn't launch. So that means one thing, or it means two things. It means, were the Qataris tipped off? Don't know. I mean, that's a little bit in conspiracy theory, and the foreign minister's already come out and said they didn't know anything about it. Or did the F-35s or whatever platform was used by the Israeli Defense Forces, did they launch the standoff munitions far enough away not to even be detected? But when you start piecing together all of the questions, there just seems to be a lot.
Mikey, thank you very much. Come back again.
Absolute pleasure. Be careful what you wish for.
Right, and just before we go, a quick update, because we've had a message from Lord Mandelson responding to those reports in The Sun that Chris was alluding to about his further messages to Jeffrey Epstein. And Lord Mandelson said, "I relied on assurances of his innocence that turned out later to be horrendously false. His lawyers claimed that it was a shakedown of him, a criminal conspiracy. I foolishly relied on their word, which I regret to this day." And what he's referring to there is some emails that have been obtained by the Sun newspaper, which show that Peter Mandelson was still emailing Jeffrey Epstein in pretty fond terms, even after Epstein had been convicted in Florida in 2008. And one other thing to update you on, the latest tally of nominations for people who want to be the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, has got 116 nominations from MPs, which means she's crossed that threshold of 80, which means she'll definitely be put to the membership when they vote on it later. And the only other person that's getting close to that is the former leader of the House of Commons, Lucy Powell, who's currently on 77 nominations. So we will see who gets to 80 when the nominations close at 5 p.m. on Thursday. Right, this episode of Newscast is closing. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.